Chicago's L system is an iconic part of the city, and a city full of amazing icons. It's also a blast from the past. The L was one of the earliest metro systems in the United States, and in the 1890s when it was getting built, elevated systems were common. But most cities moved those systems underground, not Chicago. The elevated tracks that make up the loop through downtown are from 1897 and still going strong, at least I hope. Today, Chicago's the only US city that still has elevated lines downtown.
So why are some metro systems elevated while some are below ground? Is one way better? Do elevated networks attract more NIMBYs, or are they cheaper and easier to build? Let's follow this train of thought after the bike bell. Chicago's one of my favorite cities, and the L might be one of the biggest reasons for that.
It's like the city knew it would have some of the best architecture in the United States and decided to make their mass transit a scenic tour through it all. But why is it the only major US system running above ground through skyscrapers? Well, once upon a time, lots of cities were building elevated trains like Chicago's. That includes New York City, which now has a system that's essentially named for being underground. Or the sandwich shop, I don't know which. But I do know that New York streets were snarled with traffic in the 1860s. It was a city on its way to 1.6 million people by the 1870 census. There's simply no good way to move a lot of people efficiently back then. You had stagecoaches in the 1810s and 1820s, and eventually horse-drawn omnibuses on rails in the 1830s and 40s. Steam locomotives pulled cars on those rails in subsequent years, but they're such a nuisance that they weren't allowed below 42nd Street. And any mass transit at street level, horse or otherwise, had to contend with traffic. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that mass transit needed to go either above or below street level. After many proposals, some patents, and a few false starts, New York had a steam locomotive running above street level along 9th Avenue. At its greatest extent, it ran from Battery Park all the way up to Harlem. The line ultimately closed in 1940 without much fuss. Commuters could take the parallel 8th Avenue subway line instead. But back in the 1870s, when New Yorkers were taking their first elevated rail trips, Londoners were taking their first ride on the London Tube system. That first opened in 1863 with a smokeless steam locomotive running in a tunnel from Paddington Station to King's Cross Station and on to a further stop. Was New York wrong to start building elevated lines while London built underground, considering that New York eventually started building subways? Not necessarily. Elevated lines were cheaper and faster to build. The 9th Avenue line was funded with an initial investment of $100,000 for a 40-kilometer line. The first London Tube line was built at a cost of £1 million for 6 kilometers. New York was growing faster than London at this time, and adding lines quickly was a priority. London was incredibly dense and looking to connect some of its most popular destinations, like rail stations. They're different tools for different jobs.
I'm sorry if I've offended any Chicagoans with a story about New York and a video about Chicago, so let's get back to Chicago.
If New York was growing fast during this time, Chicago was at light speed. Chicago's population doubled from 500,000 to 1 million between 1880 and 1890. It would double again in the next 20 years. The city needed fast mass transit. Elevated trains were the obvious solution. Its first line opened in 1892, right after New York's. The first few lines couldn't enter downtown, as the law required the permission of all neighbors before building over the public street. This limited the L's effectiveness, but eventually one of the transit magnates used enough cash to convince downtown property owners to allow elevated trains, and the entire system became much more effective. The loop is still the centerpiece of the system today.
Okay, I think we've done enough history for this video, so let's get into the pros and cons of elevated versus below ground.
All of this history points to one of the advantages of building elevated rail systems. In theory, they can be built faster than underground lines. This works great in areas where there's a dire need for rapid transit now. Many new rail lines in developing nations are elevated. Mumbai's metro system, for example, is 100% elevated. Running an elevated line through a dense, gridded street network can be challenging because of all those tight right angles. Chicago's L cars have to be shorter, essentially trolley length, to make it around the bends. This actually makes some sense as the original loop was a trolley loop. Underground lines don't have to conform to the street grid, and they can avoid tight corners. This can also improve speed along the line. Are elevated lines cheaper to build than underground lines? The cop-out answer is, it depends. One consideration is where it's built. Transit construction costs are higher in the United States. The projected total cost of the Honolulu skyline, when completely finished, will be about $370 million per kilometer. The average cost of an underground metro line outside the United States is only $215 million per kilometer. But in general, it's cheaper to build an elevated line than an underground line. It's much cheaper still to build an at-grade metro line, and it's one of the only affordable ways to build high-speed transit in the United States. At-grade rail lines can create barriers in the street network, though. unless they're routed in the medians of highways, but those lines have their own issues. Trains are noisy, so one would expect that to be undesirable to live next to one. Indeed, studies have shown that elevated rail lines can reduce property values along the line, while underground lines can actually raise property values. Noise is a common reason people are wary of living near trains, though people living along them do seem to get used to it. One Chicago resident said, "It just sort of blends into the background as city noise. Good windows and sound shields along the tracks can go a long way to minimize that noise. It's really not very different than living near a busy road." Noise doesn't just affect those outside the train, but those riding as well. A study of Chicago's metro system found that the loudest sounds were coming from its underground lines, as sound bounced off the tunnel walls and made it louder for passengers. The moral of the story here is that elevated train noise isn't a great argument for stopping a rail project, but that probably won't stop NIMBYs from trying. The reality is that most cities use a combination of elevated, underground, and at-grade segments, sometimes on the same line. Chicago, known for its elevated railways, has 2 subway lines running through downtown, the State Street Subway and the Dearborn Subway. And New York has plenty of lines that run elevated in the outer boroughs. For example, the 7 trains running on the Flushing Avenue line start underground in Manhattan, cross under the East River, and emerge as an elevated line just before the Court Square station. The London Underground isn't totally underground either. In fact, about 55% of the lines are above ground, making the name kind of a misnomer. The whole picture gets even more complicated when you consider that not all underground lines are the same. Cut and cover tunnels essentially dig out roadways, put the trains underground, and then build the road back over the top. Those can be less expensive to build, but are far more disruptive to people and businesses along the route. Tunnels built deeper using boring machines can avoid much of the disruption, but can be more expensive to build. And at grade could be right at ground level or down in a trench. Elevated lines can look and operate differently too. Technically, monorails are elevated mass transit. Elevated lines, underground lines, and at-grade lines are all different tools, and it's up to transit agencies to decide what the best fit is for any given situation. It's common to have elevated lines in less dense areas of a city, like the outer edges, and underground stations in the center. But as Chicago shows, that's not always the case, and it's part of the reason this system is so special. Speaking of special, we're in that special time of year when we give gifts to people we love and make donations to worthy causes. But there are over 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States alone and millions more abroad. How can you be sure that the nonprofit you choose will make the most of your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They pore over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-backed organizations that are saving and improving lives. GiveWell has now spent over 15 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funds to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $1 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that those donations will save over 150,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all this research and the recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommendation funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. As a researcher myself, I appreciate that GiveWell has 39 researchers on staff with backgrounds in economics, biology, and philosophy, and they spend 50,000 hours each year trying to find the best giving opportunities for their donors. They're doing important work like looking for independent evidence of effective work, digging into a charity's data, and reviewing their track records. If you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year or as long as the matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and select YouTube and enter City Beautiful. Make sure they found GiveWell through City Beautiful to get your match. Again, it's givewell.org to learn more and donate.